The actual fighting of the War of 1812 is not too important. If you want to go through and read about the battles in Quebec and all that, I would encourage you to do so. What's interesting to me is that the war started off with a poorly planned attack on Canada that failed. And then we can see that it really turned into a series of raids on the East Coast. The United States had a pitifully small navy at this point. Remember, 16 gunships compared to the 600 of the British fleet. And the British were largely using that navy to attack cities and towns along the coast. At one point, it's even estimated that there were more ships in the Chesapeake Bay, more British ships, than the American fleet combined. Interestingly enough, the British were offering freedom to slaves that wanted to join the British military. Many slaves did take advantage of this, about 3,000 altogether, and 400 of them were organized into a British unit, an all-black British unit called the Colonial Marines. They're going to become important in a moment. In the summer of 1814, the British actually marched on the capital of Washington, D.C. and burned it down. This had a huge psychological effect on the Americans. And 2 days later, they moved back up into Baltimore. The British went to Baltimore. And on September 13th, 42,000 British soldiers, including those Colonial Marines, the all-black unit, assaulted the city by land. And the British Navy bombarded Fort McHenry with all through the night. This is where we get the Star Spangled Banner from, because the 1,000 American soldiers held on to Fort McHenry through the bombardment and the attack. Interestingly enough, this also leads to a very embarrassing third verse of our Star Spangled Banner, which we don't often hear, which talks about not a slave was spared. And that is a reference to those Colonial Marines that were attacking. That was an especially big affront to the American system. There's this fear that the slaves would all rise up and revolt. After the Battle of Lake Champlain in upstate New York near Plattsburgh, the British Navy was essentially demolished, and this leads to a war-weary British who just want to get back to trading with the Americans. The London merchants did, deciding that it wasn't worth the cost anymore to fight the Americans. And they settled on the Treaty of Ghent, which largely reset the relationship. It restored the previous boundaries, and the British promised not to support the British Indian attacks anymore. And in the end, what we get is a national revival, a sense of a second American independence.